Morning, everybody. Committee will come to order, and the chair will call up H.R. 2937 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2937, to amend Title 49, United States Code, to provide for enhanced safety and environmental protection in pipeline transportation, to provide for enhanced reliability in the transportation of the nation's energy products by pipeline and for other purposes.
The chair would recognize himself for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute and would ask the clerk to report that amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2937, offered by Mr. Upton of Michigan and Mr. Dingell of Michigan.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and I would recognize myself for 5 minutes in support of the amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself and Chairman Emeritus Dingell is a significant technical and qualitative improvement of the base text. I want to thank my friend and colleague from the great state of Michigan for his hard work and contribution towards this effort. It has been a bipartisan collaboration from the beginning and rises to the best traditions and values, certainly, of this committee. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes numerous important changes to H.R. 2937. Though the basic framework remains intact, the amendment substantially clarifies many provisions and provides added safety benefits to others. Among the changes are these: a requirement that PHMSA develop regulations to address pipelines under riverbeds if their review of existing pipelines is not adequate, modification of state one-call program requirements so no unintended consequences result from the bill's elimination of certain one-call exemptions, additional factors for PHMSA to consider when evaluating the expansion of integrity management requirements, clarification of PHMSA's authority regarding carbon dioxide pipeline safety standards, additional PHMSA studies on gas pipeline leak detection systems, and participation of minority and women-owned businesses in the pipeline industry. The amendment greatly improves the underlying text and enhances regulatory certainty in what is a very complex and technical area of law and regulations. I want to thank Mr. Dingell, Mr. Waxman, and their staff, particularly Greg Sundstrom and Jeff Barron, for their hard work and cooperation in putting forward a very worthy bill. And with that, I yield the balance of my time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment in the nature? Gentleman from the great state of Michigan, Mr. Dingell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for moving this bill along. I want to commend you for your remarkable leadership in this. And I want to observe that we have legislation today of which we can all be proud. And in a time when this place is not known either for its effectiveness or for the bipartisanship with which we proceed, you may take the bow for having done a splendid job in seeing to it that this is both bipartisan, a good piece of legislation, and one which deserves enactment and support by all of our colleagues. The amendment in the nature of a substitute takes a balanced approach to the issue of pipelines of safety and will help fix many of the existing deficiencies in our current system. I will observe that this amendment is not only bipartisan, but it has the support of everybody concerned, including the industry. Specifically, the bill expands the integrity management program while phasing out class location requirements. This puts a stronger safety standard in place while taking steps to remove redundant regulations. The legislation mandates the use of automatic and remote control shutoff valves for new pipelines and requires studies of the feasibility of retrofitting. The leak detection standards is a significant improvement on existing law and will help us increase public safety. I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for reaching across the aisle and working in such a constructive manner. And I want to congratulate my colleagues and friends on this side, including my friend Mr. Waxman. We believe we should send this bill to the President's desk, and I urge all of our colleagues to support the legislation and to work with us to, again, work with our colleagues on the transportation and infrastructure to bring the legislation to the floor. I think it should be observed, Mr. President, or rather, Mr. Chairman, that there are real concerns remaining about pipeline safety. Pipeline safety was a very much ignored situation in this country for many years. And it took this committee, with its leadership, a lot of very hard work to see to it that both the statutes were moved in the proper direction and also that administration of the law was moved in the proper direction. When one of these pipelines goes off and leaks in an urban area, if it's natural gas pipeline, the result can be calamitous, and deaths and property destruction of enormous magnitude can follow. Similar problems in terms of long-term consequences from oil pipelines failing can be seen and heard and felt for years to come. We know, as you do, Mr. Chairman, that we've had similar experiences in Michigan recently, and the consequences are going to be cursing us in a rather wonderful area of our state for years to come. So I commend you. I am delighted to see us behaving in a proper bipartisan fashion. I'm pleased that we have a good piece of legislation, that the committee has worked together well. I look forward to working with you on this matter and hopefully in the future. And I would observe that the legislation deserves to move and that the amendment that we're about to vote on be adopted overwhelmingly. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my colleagues who have worked on this and the staff that has done a good job. Thank you. I yield back.
Appreciate the gentleman's kind words. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Would recognize the gentlelady from California to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The issue of pipeline safety is one that I take really very, very seriously, and I know that members of the committee do as well. Just about a year ago, a little over a year ago, on September 9th, 2010, in San Bruno, California, which is just north of my congressional district, a natural gas explosion killed 8 people. It injured dozens. It destroyed or damaged over 100 homes. And most frankly, it wrecked lives. And I think there isn't a member here that didn't read about this tragedy that took place on the front pages, carried on the front pages of our nation's newspapers and on the electronic media. In this committee, we heard concerns from some of the stakeholders that pipelines carrying diluted bitumen may pose greater safety risks than pipelines carrying conventional crude. I was surprised at the time when there was testimony given by Cynthia Quarterman, the administrator of PHMSA, which is the agency responsible for regulating pipelines, that the agency had not done a study to analyze the risks associated with transporting diluted bitumen. That's why on June 23rd of this year, during the full Energy and Commerce Committee markup of the bill relating to the Keystone XL pipeline, I offered an amendment to require such a study. Now, I withdrew the amendment, as you know, Mr. Chairman, at your request, so that we could address the issue during the pipeline safety bill. Is that your understanding, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, it is. And I would note that the pipeline safety bill does direct PHMSA to complete a comprehensive review of all hazardous liquid pipeline facilities regulations to determine whether these regulations are sufficient to regulate pipeline facilities used for the transportation of diluted bitumen, and the Secretary shall report the results of the review to our committee. That is in the bill, and it is a good provision in the bill, and I appreciate the gentlelady for those suggestions, not only during the subcommittee markup and the hearings that we had, but in essence, it is there as it should be.
Well, I appreciate what you did to help move this along. I think it's a good first step, requiring PHMSA to review the issue. Now, if the review determines that the current regulations are not sufficient, I think it'll be important for the committee and for PHMSA to act quickly to address any weaknesses in the standard. Mr. Chairman, do I have your commitment to do everything that you can to protect this study provision as the bill moves to the floor, and to act swiftly if the PHMSA study reveals the need for updated regulations.
Yes, you do. You
Thank
have
you,
my
Mr. Chairman,
assurance.
and
It's an important provision, and we would look to act quickly under my
Excellent.
leadership and
Thank
your
you, Mr.
participation.
Chairman, very much. I yield back.
Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Illinois,
I would like the
Mr. Rush,
word.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to first of all commend both yourself and Mr. Upton and the ranking member, Mr. Waxman, and also the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Whitfield, and Mr. Ding also, for this outstanding work that you all have done on this bipartisan bill. I am pleased that you have agreed to include language from my office that would direct the Secretary of Transportation to submit to Congress a report on the number of minority business enterprises, women business enterprises, and disadvantaged business enterprises that have been granted permits to build or operate pipelines, and to the extent to which pipeline operators utilize the services of companies that are registered as minority-owned and women-owned, or as a disadvantaged business enterprise. And Mr. Chairman, I really I was kind of astounded at the testimony of the official from the AOPL when they came to testify before the subcommittee, and I asked for the membership, minority-owned membership, women-owned membership of their association, and they could not forward me any determination. They couldn't forward the information, and I asked them to give me the information in a letter, and when I received the letter, they indicated that they didn't have the information, that they don't keep those records, which tells me that there aren't any. And in this era, when we're trying to ensure diversity and trying to ensure that everyone have economic opportunities, I'm just kind of astounded that that there are no members, or that this information isn't forthcoming, because the data just doesn't exist, because there is no members of the minorities or women who have been contracted. And so I'm looking forward to this study, and Mr. Chairman, I ask that you will also pay close attention to this particular study, because I think this study is important to the American people, and it's a study that is very, very important as we move forward on these particular matters.
Gentleman, yield.
I will certainly yield to the ranking member.
You've completed your comments. I agree with you and all the others who have talked so far on this bill. I think it's a good bipartisan effort. I'm pleased that we were able to work together to accomplish this goal. I want to commend Chairman Upton and Mr. Dingell particularly for their active role in fashioning the compromise. It's in the great tradition of this committee to have compromises, to work out bills, and I'm pleased the Chairman started our markup with this bill where we can all be together, because the others are going to be a lot more contentious. But I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and the final passage of the bill. Thank the gentleman for yielding to it.
Yield back.
Chairman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, the vote now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill as amended to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a roll call vote.
Gentleman requests a roll call vote. I might ask if we might roll the vote until the first vote in the next series.
I have no objection.
If that's without objection, we'll do that, just because some members are not here, and we'll We'll do that first when we have the next recorded vote there. The chair will now call up H.R. 2250 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2250, to provide additional time for the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to issue achievable standards for industrial, commercial, and institutional boilers, process heaters, and incinerators, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
I'm looking for Mr. Griffith.
Mr. Chairman, it's not bipartisan now, but I believe it will be. I have an amendment at the desk that I believe will make some members of the
all right,
other side happy.
Let me come back to you next. Let me just ask if there are any bipartisan amendments ready to be offered. If not, I would recognize for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2250, offered by Mr. Griffith of Virginia.
The
gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment is a pretty straightforward amendment. We heard in the subcommittee some concern about the 15 months and the language that you see being amended. It says, or on such later date as may be determined by the administrator. That caused some folks some heartburn, so we're striking that language that says, or on such later date as may be determined by the administrator, which would make the finalization of the regulations would have to be done 15 months after the passage of this bill. And I would ask everybody to vote for it. I think it clarifies what our intent and our purpose was on this bill. I'm happy to answer any questions members might have.
Gentleman yield back his time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia? Mr. Waxman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Boilers, Mr. Chairman, boilers are the second largest source of toxic mercury air pollution in the United States. We know that if we don't require modern pollution controls to be installed on boilers, that more babies will be born with birth defects, more babies will be born with brain damage, more children will not develop to reach their true potential. Unfortunately, the bill before us today sets up a triple line of attack on the Clean Air Act to ensure that industry never has to cut its toxic pollution from boilers. First, the legislation removes any deadline for pollution sources to ever have to comply with the law. Explicitly under the bill, no compliance can be required within 5 years. But the bill goes even further, saying that there is no deadline whatsoever for when sources must reduce pollution. It can be 10 years, 15 years, or any other date. Second, the legislation introduces new legal uncertainties into the Clean Air Act's standard-setting process for air toxics. If enacted, this legislation will guarantee years of litigation and could likely result in weak or meaningless standards ultimately being adopted. And finally, although EPA's requested the courts to provide until April 2012 to reconsider the boiler rule, this legislation blocks EPA action until 15 months after the date of enactment, or at least early 2013. The amendment before us improves one of these three problems by stating that EPA must finalize a new boiler rule on the date that is exactly 15 months from the date of enactment. This is a very odd way to draft legislation, but I don't oppose it. However, all members should understand that even with the adoption of this amendment, 2 out of the 3 attacks on Clean Air Act remain. The standards will be litigated and likely weakened or eviscerated. Unless all of these problems are fixed, industrial boilers will continue to emit toxic air pollution uncontrolled. The people who are most affected are those who are nearby these facilities, often low income, often minority people whose children will be exposed to mercury. Whoever they are that will be exposed to this mercury, it's something that we should not allow to continue on an indefinite basis, and I hope members will be mindful of that when we get to final passage of the bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the Griffith Amendment? If gentleman from Georgia,
Mr. Chairman,
Dr.
just
Gingrich.
real quickly, this amendment would strike or such later date as may be determined by the administrator. So it seems to me, as Representative Griffith said, this is a simple, clear amendment. It clarifies and removes any shadow of a doubt in regard to the 15 months if the administrator might delay it even further. This removes that possibility, and I'm in favor of the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there other gentlemen from Illinois?
Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of that is kind of contagious of bipartisan contagion that's going on in this committee, I want to, I have an amendment that if my amendment is agreed upon, then we might be able to get this bill, from my perspective, I might be able to support the entire bill. But, Mr. Chairman, we fixed one aspect of this bill that I thought was confusing and dilatory, but now there's an additional concern that I have, and during her testimony at the September 8th hearing, Gina McCarthy, the Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, she called this bill the direct attack on at the core of the Clean Air Act.
Mr. Chairman, he hadn't offered the amendment yet.
If the gentleman from Illinois will yield 1 second, are you going to offer an amendment, or do you want to strike the last word?
Well, I want to offer an amendment.
Offer the amendment?
Right.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2250, offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and now the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
All right. Well, that's a good way of getting more time. Thank you. I want to say one of the concerns that I have is that the bill would indefinitely we've dealt with the indefinite delaying of the bill, but additionally, Mr. Chairman, as Mrs. McCarthy testified before the subcommittee, H.R. 2250 would raise additional public health concerns by weakening substantive Clean Air Act provisions by requiring that the EPA select, quote, the least burdensome, end of quote, of the range of regulatory alternatives, even if a more stringent standard is feasible, economically viable, and would provide greater public health protection. And as written in Section 5 of H.R. 2250, it would raise legal uncertainty, and industry could then argue in the courts that this new language should modify or supersede existing provisions of the Clean Air Act, which were designed to achieve maximum reductions in toxic air pollution. While it remains unclear if this was the intent of the language or not, the fact remains that the language in Section 5 is ambiguous, or at best will roll back important provisions of the Clean Air Act at worst. Mr. Chairman, the research also tells us that low-income families and minorities are disproportionately affected by toxic air pollution because they are more likely to live closer to these industrial facilities. The hazardous air pollutants emitted from these boilers, including mercury and other harmful toxins, can impair brain development, neurological function, and the ability to learn, as well as potentially cause cancer. These toxins can also lead to respiratory and cardiovascular disease by damaging the kidneys, lungs, and nervous system. So, Mr. Chairman, the amendment that I'm offering today will clarify that Section 5 of H.R. 2250 is intended to supplement the provisions of and shall not be construed to supersede any requirement, limitation, or other provision of sections 112 and 129 of the Clean Air Act. If it is the majority's intent to clarify these rules and provide certainty for business, then this amendment will clearly bring clarity to the EPA, to the industry, and the courts going forward, as these rules are inevitably challenged in the judicial system. So, Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of contagious bipartisanship this morning, I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there members, Mr. Shimkus from Illinois?
I speak in opposition to the amendment, Mr. Chairman. The whole basis of the this piece of legislation, H.R. 2250, is to have achievable standards. Standards that can be achieved in real world operations. EPA currently does a pollutant by pollutant analysis. The problem with that is that when they do that, the standards they set cannot be achieved by current technology. So, and I don't question my colleague's intent and his concern, but what our concern is to make sure that when the EPA moves on these processes, that the language of this legislation and the word achievable is really key to this piece of legislation, because they have to be able to be met under actual operating conditions, not some theoretical pie in the sky theory. Because if EPA does assign standards that can't be met by current technology, we know what will happen. Industry will shut down, and the things that are produced in this sector will be produced elsewhere. So that's why I reluctantly oppose my colleague's amendment. I'd be happy to yield.
Yeah, I hear the gentleman's concerns, but Mr. Chairman, I am particularly concerned about this section. This section appears to rewrite the way EPA sets emissions limits for toxic pollutions, and will make it harder to achieve meaningful reductions from boilers and incinerators. Section 5 puts new constraints and conditions on how and when the EPA can set specific emission standards for toxic pollution. It also requires the EPA to select what I said, what I call in my opening statement, the, quote, least burdensome regulatory option when deciding how to cut emissions. But the bill is silent on what least burdensome means. Does this mean that EPA can only require boilers to perform annual facility tune-ups? Or does it mean that EPA can continue to set achievable emission standards, but must consider the least burdensome option when going beyond what the law requires? These are two distinct legal interpretations of the language. At minimum, this bill will create a new litigation process and more delay. And I fear that this section could require EPA to lower the bar for reduction of toxic air pollution. Rather than require the most polluting facilities to do more to reduce their toxic emission, EPA could just require everyone to do less. And from the standpoint of public health, this is totally unacceptable. And I yield back to the gentleman.
Reclaiming our time, I would just continue to just make the point that if EPA sets standards that are not achievable by real-world technology, then the option is to shut down the facility and not have the jobs and move them overseas. So the achievable language is key in the reforms needed in this piece of legislation, and I continue to oppose the amendment. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the Rush amendment. Proponents of this bill suggest that it gives industry regulatory certainty. I disagree. This bill just adds more confusion to what is already a long overdue effort to reduce toxic air pollution from boilers and incinerators. In addition to providing no timeline for implementation of new emission standards, the bill creates significant questions about how EPA would set limits for toxic air pollution. We know what the law currently requires. The Clean Air Act takes a reasonable approach. It says that EPA should set emission limits based on the emission levels already being achieved by similar facilities in the real world. For existing sources, EPA bases the emission standard for each pollutant on the average emissions achieved by the best performing 12% of facilities, not the top 1% or even 5%, the top 12%. This has been a standard that's been in place for 20 years. It's worked well. 100 categories of sources are already achieving this requirement. But Section 5 of this bill creates legal uncertainty about whether EPA will be able to follow this model for boilers and incinerators. It directs EPA to select the, quote, least burdensome regulatory alternative. The idea of least burdensome sounds appealing, but history shows that it can be a problem. That exact language was included in the Toxic Substances Control Act, where it proved to be completely unworkable. The so-called burden on industry should be one of the factors EPA takes into account when weighing the different options for how to cut toxic air pollution. But it should not be the only one. EPA should have the flexibility to choose a regulatory path that is feasible and protects public health. The attorneys with years of experience litigating the Clean Air Act told our committee that this section will exempt boilers and incinerators from having to achieve maximum reductions in toxic air pollution. At best, the current language is ambiguous, driving new litigation. At worst, it will eviscerate toxic air pollution standards for some of the largest sources of toxic air pollution, including mercury. The Rush Amendment clarifies the intention of this language. It simply states that the language in this section supplements but does not replace the requirement that EPA set numeric emission limits based on the best performing emissions reduction technology, unless such limits are not feasible. It's time for our colleagues to clarify what this language means rather than leave it to industry to litigate for years and then later for the courts to decide. Members who want this bill to gut the Clean Air Act and allow these boilers and incinerators continue polluting without limits will oppose this amendment. But if you want to clean up neurotoxins and carcinogens in communities across the country, particularly in low-income communities with minority groups, if you want to keep our kids healthy, you will support this amendment to preserve the Clean Air Act tools to cut toxic air pollution and protect public health. So I urge support for the Rush Amendment.
Would the gentleman yield for just 30 seconds?
Be happy to yield.
Because he brought up the question, the ranking member brought up the question of ambiguity. I think our position, my position would be it's been ambiguity that's kept a lot of this in litigation since 2004. So I would argue the opposite, that this helps provide additional guidance to the EPA, and that's why I still stand in opposition. I yield back. Thank you.
Well, reclaiming my time, we have a law that's been in effect for 20 years. It's worked well. Whatever issues that might have been ambiguous in that law have already been settled. And now we're coming in with a replacement for it. And that replacement, we believe, is ambiguous. So if you make this a supplement to the existing law, it would give the EPA the instructions that they ought to be mindful of the costs to industry. But if you make this amendment, as this bill does, a replacement, it invites additional litigation, and additional litigation invites additional years where the matter won't be settled. And during that whole period of time, mercury toxic emissions will continue to pollute these communities with a lot of low-income people usually, with a lot of minorities, Hispanics, African Americans. Those are the people who suffer the most from these kinds of emissions. And when it comes to something like mercury, We're talking about a toxin that can kill and injure children and make them least able to succeed in life. So I would urge adoption of the Rush Amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would add a provision stating that Section 5 is intended to supplement and not supersede any requirement, limitation, or other provisions of Section 112 and 129 of the Clean Air Act. Those sections direct the EPA to set maximum achievable control technology for sources that emit hazardous pollutants. While it should be clear from the statute that these be achievable in practice, courts have created ambiguities. And Chairman Emeritus Waxman is correct. The code references 12%, and he is correct in his citing of that. However, when he says that it's not 1% or even 5%, that may be true in the code, but that's not true in the actions that we have seen. The testimony that we have heard indicates that both on this bill and I believe on the Cement MAC bill, that the EPA standards are actually going for 2% of what is currently achievable in industry. And the clear language was that it was to be 12%, although it did give the administrator the ability to have some flexibility, but I don't think they intended for it to be 2%. And what's interesting, when you look at the language, it says excluding units, in other words, you're not to count in that 12% units which may have first met the lowest achievable emission rates 18 months before the date of such standards are proposed or 30 months before the date of such standards are promulgated, whichever is later. So clearly, it looks like we need action and we need clarification for the EPA because it does not appear they're following the rules as stated in the language and as acknowledged by Chairman Emeritus Waxman. And so I would submit to you that this amendment needs to be rejected. Further, this amendment actually does create confusion for the EPA because the agency would have to choose between the existing language in the statute and the language that is in the bill and Congress's clarifications in this bill, and that those standards are to be set as achievable in practice by real-world facilities. It's understandable that some folks are just going to be against the bill, and in that sense, we have the debate that we consistently have when we're talking about regulations. One side argues jobs, the other side argues health care. But I would point out that in regard to this bill, I do believe it's significant based on the evidence we heard in the hearings in the subcommittee. This bill would be a significant job creation benefit. It also will keep a lot of jobs, particularly in the manufacturing sector, from leaving the country. And we heard numerous testimony to that effect, particularly from the 9th District of Virginia. In regard to adopting the amendment, I would ask you to reject it. And as Jefferson says in the Jefferson's Manual, he that would totally destroy, referencing the bill, will not amend it, or as said in gray, the child is not to be put to a nurse that cares not for it. And I would submit this is an amendment submitted by one who cares not for the bill, and it should be rejected. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seen none. Oh, I'm sorry.
Chairman?
Gentleman from New York.
Yeah. I yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
Mr. Chairman, help me, somebody, okay? I need you all, this remarkable group of people who are no more than scientists, and you've impressed me with your arguments since over these last few months about how you all can rewrite science and things like that. But help me to understand what does in Section 5, when this bill requires the EPA to select the, quote, least burdensome of the range of regulatory alternatives. What does least burdensome mean? Maybe somebody can tell me that. If you can just tell me in your mind, what is least burdensome? How would you interpret least burdensome? How would you argue that the EPA come up with the least burdensome alternatives, regulatory alternatives? How would you define it? Tell
the gentleman yield.
Mean. Yes, I yield.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to yield.
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to try to answer his question for him. Least burdensome, like in so many endeavors, it is the amount, the easiest way to carry the burden. Imagine a pack on your back. What you want to do is to figure out a way that you can carry that pack to the destination you wish to go with having the lightest weight on you and without bending you down to the ground. And I would submit that what is happening currently as the regulations as proposed are bending businesses down to the ground, and many of them will never finish their trek and they will collapse under the weight. Least burdensome means to lift that weight off their backs a little bit, to make it the least or make it the best way possible for them to carry that load that we want them to carry, to make it to their destination without crippling them.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois.
Well, I thank the gentleman because he's really, in his definition, he's really kind of made clear my point in terms of asking the question. First of all, we're not backpacking, we're legislating. All right, we're not mountain climbing or we're not walking along a trail. We're legislating, and so I don't understand the example of backpacking. But he also, just made my point because he have indicated that in terms of his interpretation of what least burdensome is, it certainly don't agree with what my interpretation of what least burdensome would be. Particularly as it relates to more stringent standards, if there are more stringent standards that are economically feasible, viable, and will provide greater public health protection. That's the part, that's the aspect of legislating as opposed to backpacking. We are here trying to not only get to a certain goal, but we're also trying to provide greater public health protection. And so I think, Mr. Chairman, that the gentleman's definition completely brings the point home that any two individuals that will have adversary positions on this are going to disagree. And when it winds up, it's going to wind up in court. And it's going to delay and delay and further delay because this language is really ambiguous. And we need to try to either correct the language or get the language out. I'm asking that you clarify this language. Clarify it before we take a vote on it.
Would the gentleman yield for 53 seconds? Gentleman from New York.
I'd be delighted to yield.
Part of the use of this language comes out of the President's Executive Order 13563, which says an agency should tailor its regulations to impose the least burden on society. So many of our debates this year have been on the President's executive orders that he issued in January to say we need to have regulations, but they got to make sure that they don't destroy job creation. So that's why we use that language, and I yield back my time to the gentleman from New York.
On that note, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
I would just like to ask the council a couple of questions. In the debate on this Boiler Act legislation, we've heard a lot of comment about mercury, the reduction of mercury, and how important that is. And we all recognize that. But I would ask the council, in the benefits calculated by EPA in issuing the regulation on Boiler Act, did they determine that there would be any benefit at all from the reduction of mercury for Boiler Act?
They didn't calculate a benefit for reductions in mercury.
So they did not calculate any benefit from that. So all of their benefit would come from reduction in particulate matter, not hazardous air pollutants.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. Noes appear to have it. The gentleman, noes have it. The gentleman from California asked for a roll call. The clerk will call the roll on this amendment, and immediately following this amendment, we will have the vote on final passage on H.R. 2937, the pipeline safety bill, which was debated earlier. So the clerk will call the roll on the Rush. This is on the Rush amendment.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes no. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Are there other members wishing to vote? Mr. Walden.
Mr. Walden votes no.
Mr. Sullivan.
Mr. Sullivan votes no.
Mr. Harper.
Mr. Harper
Scalise.
votes no. Who is it?
Other members?
Mr. Scalise
Inslee.
votes no.
Mr. Inslee.
Mr. Inslee votes aye.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote? He did. Scalise voted. Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Reminder to members that we'll be voting immediately on the final passage of the pipeline safety bill and once the clerk reports the vote. Mr. Murphy. How is Mr. Murphy recorded?
Mr. Murphy is not recorded.
Mr. Murphy votes no.
Mr. Murphy votes no.
Hmm?
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 35 noes, 16 ayes.
35 noes, 16 ayes. The amendment is not agreed to. The clerk will now call the roll on H.R. 2937, Pipeline Safety Bill as amended. Final passage.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkiss. Mr. Shimkiss votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Sullivan?
Mr. Sullivan votes aye.
Mr. Inslee?
Mr. Inslee votes aye.
Gentleman from Utah?
Mr. Matheson votes aye.
Gentlelady from Colorado?
Ms. DeGette votes aye.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote? If not, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 51 ayes, 0 nays.
51 ayes, 0 nays. The bill, H.R. 2937, is favorably reported. At this point, the committee will return to H.R. 2250, the Boiler Mac EPA Regulatory Relief Act. Are there other amendments to this bill? Gentlelady from Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2250 offered by Ms. Baldwin of Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, and the staff will pass out the contents of the amendment. And the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my home state of Wisconsin, I've heard from a number of manufacturers, including paper and pulp producers and beer makers, about the Boiler MACT rule. And I've also heard from doctors and public health officials and parents of children with asthma about the Boiler MACT rule. In each instance, everyone has asked for certainty. They want certainty as these standards are going to be put into place. And the legislation before us today fails to answer this fundamental request from both industry and public health officials.
Gentleman is correct. Gentlelady will proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment seeks to address this issue of certainty, as well as several of the issues that we have been debating this morning in the underlying bill, H.R. 2250. We dealt earlier with an amendment offered by Representative Griffith dealing with the minimum of 15 months to finalize new standards. I voted for his amendment because I think it improves the underlying bill, but I think the way that I've dealt with it in this amendment is actually an improvement upon Mr. Griffith's amendment. The underlying legislation, Section 2, requires EPA to wait a minimum of 15 months to finalize new standards. While this sets the minimum time EPA must wait until we adopted the Griffith Amendment, there was no requirement as to when the standards must be finalized. In effect, the current administration or a future administration could delay finalizing the standards indefinitely. I heard from one business, by the way, with an industrial boiler that said, our company wants to avoid spending capital to comply until there is certainty of what will be required of us to meet the standard. What my amendment would do in this provision is provide that certainty by requiring EPA to finalize the rule within the 15-month period, as opposed to on that day certain at the end of the 15-month period. That would allow this administration, as well as the next, which may be also the same president, to continue working on it during the 15-month period and announce a final rule at any point during that time. And I think that's a preferred way to deal with this. Secondly, my amendment fixes another open-ended compliance date in this legislation. Right now, the legislation allows the EPA administrator to set the compliance dates no earlier than 5 years. But as currently worded, and this is really important, as currently worded in the underlying bill, the administrator could set the compliance dates at 10 years, 20 years, or maybe even 30 years. And I don't like to see our committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, cede its jurisdiction to the executive branch in this way. I believe that we need to set firm dates in place here, and my amendment would allow for a maximum of 5 years for the regulated entities to comply. This is a change from existing law, which sets out a 3-year compliance window. The last part of my amendment would address what has become known as the Frankenplant issue. I'm not sure who makes up these phrases, but I've heard this Frankenplant a number of times in this debate. Some have said that the EPA rule creates a set of standards that are not literally or physically attainable with current industrial boilers. The underlying legislation attempts to address this issue by directing EPA to make apples to oranges comparisons. For example, in selecting the best controlled sources, which are the basis for the standards, EPA would be forced to make really horrible subjective decisions like, is it more important to reduce a carcinogen or a neurotoxin? I mean, that's not the sort of situation we want to put our EPA or anyone in. I believe that inserting this uncertainty will only lead to further litigation, as we've seen in the past, and further delays. Again, totally the opposite of what industry has requested of us, which is certainty and a clear path. My amendment would address industry concerns by explicitly directing the EPA to address this issue. If control technology for one pollutant interferes with controlling another pollutant, EPA must take that into account and make sure that plants can, in fact, meet all pollution control in requirements simultaneously. So that is an outline of the 3 provisions. I think it deals well with exactly the issues that we've been talking about during today's debate, and I hope that my colleagues will accept this amendment and advance the bill. I would yield back my remaining time.
Gentlelady yields back her balance of time. Does anyone seek recognition to speak in opposition to the amendment on our side? Mr. Griffith is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would require the EPA to issue the new rules within 15 months of enactment of the Act, remove the area source rule, boiler rule from the bill, require the EPA to set up a maximum compliance period of 5 years and prohibit any extensions of the 5-year period, and then strike the heart of the bill, Section 5. The date for issuing the rules, 15 months, is a short period for finalizing complex rules, and we should not amend it to allow the EPA to rush the rules. These rules involve detailed data and analysis and for many boiler types and affect thousands of facilities nationwide. The EPA needs enough time to issue the rules and get them right. Under the current rules, sources have 3 years to comply with Section 112 standards, boilers, and 5 years to comply with Section 129 standards, incinerators. The legislation directs the EPA to set compliance dates of at least 5 years, taking into account real-world considerations like costs, equipment, and labor, and time for permitting, procuring, and installing the equipment. We heard testimony from one employer in the 9th District of Virginia, which I am proud to represent, that even if they decided that the best way to go was to switch to natural gas, it would take a considerable amount of time to figure out how they were going to get the natural gas there, because there is not currently in the area where that facility is located a line with sufficient supply to switch their boilers over to natural gas. And to get around the mountains, and I'm sure other areas have other barriers, natural barriers that cause problems, it will take them quite a bit of time after they analyze whether or not they can meet the current requirements without switching over to natural gas. We should not deprive the administrator of flexibility to adjust dates if real-world considerations warrant that adjustment. These rules, moreover, come at a time when EPA has been issuing many other rules which are converging on the U.S. industrial and manufacturing sector. Compliance will be difficult due to the technical challenges of integrating all of these new rules. The bill directs the EPA to reissue this rule, which affects smaller boilers as well. The amendment would take this rule out of the bill. We should not do that because this particular part applies to 187,000 boilers. The rule imposes tune-up efficiency assessments and in some instances numeric emission limits. The rule has been challenged and it needs to be fixed. The amendment goes to the heart of the legislation by effectively striking it. This goes to the very core of what we're trying to do. Its focus is to ensure EPA sets standards that are achievable in practice by real-world facilities operating under actual, not theorized conditions. I would urge all of my colleagues to vote no on the amendment, and I appreciate your time. You yield back my time.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Yeah, and I appreciate him taking the lead and speaking in opposition. My colleague from Wisconsin is correct on the uncertainty debates from both sides. Our issue, and so I applaud her in identifying that, because that's the same debate that industry and the business community is saying across the board. I would agree with my colleague from Virginia in that again, the heart of this is having standards that are achievable in real-world operations and allowing these boilers to operate so that we make a decision of whether we keep these jobs or they are moved elsewhere. I am also concerned about the area source rule issue and the 187,000 boilers, which then you'd have to restart the whole process on. So with that, I agree with my colleague from Virginia, and I appreciate his time, and I yield back to him.
Yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I support my colleague's amendment, which ameliorates but does not solve several of the fundamental problems with this bill. First, Section 2 of the bill effectively nullifies EPA's boiler rules. It directs EPA to promulgate new standards for boilers and incinerators, but then turns around and prohibits EPA from finalizing these regulations for at least 15 months. The Baldwin Amendment will ensure that EPA can finalize the rule when it has completed its work. This is one necessary improvement. The bill also includes other ways to delay pollution reductions. Section 3 of the bill bars EPA from requiring facilities to reduce pollution to comply with any revised standard for at least 5 years, and it allows for compliance to be delayed indefinitely. The Baldwin Amendment caps the compliance time at 5 years. This still is too long, especially for communities with high levels of toxic air pollution that have been waiting for cleaner air for decades. But at least this provision should provide certainty to industry, and it will eventually provide relief to the communities living near these boilers and incinerators. But the problems with the bill go well beyond the delays. Even if EPA sets standards, they won't clean up the air unless they require real pollution reductions. And the bill likely prevents EPA from adopting meaningful standards. The bill's new language for setting the standards may well replace the current Clean Air Act criteria for setting numeric emission limits for these sources. The likely result will be more toxic air emissions of mercury, lead, and carcinogens. The certain result will be more litigation and delay. Under the Clean Air Act, EPA sets emission limits based on the reductions actually being achieved for each pollutant by better performing sources. This makes sense since each pollutant has different health effects, may need different types of pollution control. Section 5 of the bill may require EPA to set emissions limits based on the sources that perform best across all the regulated pollutants. This sounds fine, but is completely unworkable. How is EPA supposed to decide whether a source emitting fewer neurotoxins or fewer carcinogens is better performing? Section 5 may also prevent EPA from setting numeric emissions limits altogether. This section directs EPA to select the least burdensome regulatory alternative when deciding how to reduce toxic pollution from these sources, and this may amount to nothing more than requiring periodic boiler tune-ups. Mr. Rush asked this question and did not get an answer. If existing sources are using pollution control technologies, can EPA set standards based on those technologies? Or must EPA simply require annual boiler tune-ups? That would certainly be less burdensome. It is also far less cleanup than the Clean Air Act provides. The Baldwin Amendment strikes this ambiguous and potentially extreme language and replaces it with a simple provision that directly responds to the concerns industry has raised. It directs EPA to address concerns about meeting the emissions limits for each pollutant at the same time using EPA's existing authority. This amendment does not remove all my concerns about the bill, but it does improve it significantly, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Is there further discussion on the amendment? In that case, the question will now be on the Baldwin Amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No.
Chairman, request a roll call vote.
The gentleman requests a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield.
No.
Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. No. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Aye. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Aye. Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Aye. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Aye. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Aye. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Aye. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Aye. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Aye. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Aye. Mr. Inslee votes aye. Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Ms. Baldwin votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. No. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Aye. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Chairman Upton. Chairman Upton. Chairman Upton votes no.
The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Stearns votes no. Ms. Myrick.
No.
Ms. Myrick votes no.
Dr. Burgess.
Mr. Burgess votes no.
Mr. Bilbray.
Mr. Bilbray votes no.
Ms. Blackburn.
Ms. Blackburn votes no.
Mr. Butterfield.
Mr. Butterfield votes no.
Has everyone had the opportunity to vote? Will the clerk report the vote, please?
No, I got you guys. -3, one more, 20. Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 17 ayes, 34 noes.
17 ayes, 34 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments on 2250? If not, the question now would occur on favorably reporting the bill as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes. Gentleman from California. Gentleman from California requests a roll call vote. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Barton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Whitfield.
Aye.
Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Aye. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack votes aye. Mr. Walden. Aye. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Aye. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Aye. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Aye. Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Aye. Mr. Sullivan votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Aye. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns.
No.
Mr. Towns votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush.
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green.
Aye.
Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Chairman Upton. Chairman Upton votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye.
Has everyone had the opportunity to cast a vote on this legislation? Appears that everyone has cast a vote. Will the clerk please report the tally?
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 36 ayes, 14 nays.
36 ayes and 14 nays on H.R. 2250 as amendment. So the bill has been favorably reported. The chair would now call up H.R. 2681 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2681, to provide additional time for the administrator of the Environmental Protection
Without
Agency.
objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, so ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to H.R. 2681? Mr. Chair recognizes Mr. Sullivan. What purpose do you seek recognition, Mr. Sullivan?
Affirm my amendment.
The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2681 offered by Mr. Sullivan of Oklahoma.
The gentleman will be recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to offer this amendment. It would require EPA to repropose and finalize rules for the cement manufacturing industry on the date that is 15 months of enactment of the Act. Under the bill, EPA must issue replacement rules for 3 rules that were issued by the agency during the past year. Section 2A2 currently directs EPA to finalize those regulations on that date, that is 15 months after the date of enactment of this Act, or such later date as may be determined by the administrator. This amendment would strike, or such later date as may be determined by the administrator. The clause being struck was intended to provide modest discretion to EPA in the event the agency needed it. The effect of this amendment would be to direct EPA to issue the new rules on the date that is 15 months after enactment of the Act. These are complex rulemakings, and this will put EPA on a definitive schedule, as well as address any concerns raised by my colleagues that the legislation as drafted would result in EPA delaying issuing the new rules. At the same time, by directing EPA to take 15 months, it will ensure that EPA has a reasonable period of time to repropose and finalize these complex rules. This timing reflects the schedule that was always contemplated in this bipartisan legislation for issuing the rules. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
Gentleman yields back balance at this time. For what purpose the gentleman from
strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Mr. Sullivan for his amendment. I still have some concerns with the bill, namely with the language in Section 5, but this amendment is a great step in the right direction. we can now be assured that this rule will be issued and will not be indefinitely delayed, and our businesses will have the regulatory certainty they need to plan and invest. Again, I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Sullivan, for this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to support it, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are there further, for what purpose does the gentleman of California seek recognition?
Speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, for far too long, cement kilns have been allowed to emit neurotoxins, carcinogens, and other hazardous air pollutants without any controls. In fact, cement kilns are one of the largest sources of toxic mercury air pollution in the United States. Mercury pollution can have a devastating impact on babies' developing brains, leading to birth defects, brain damage, and learning disabilities in children. This bill attacks the Clean Air Act on multiple fronts to ensure that cement kilns can continue to pollute without limits. First, the legislation removes any deadline for cement kilns to comply with any emissions standards. Under the bill, EPA cannot require compliance for at least 5 years after the regulations are finalized. The bill also eliminates the Clean Air Act deadline for when cement kilns must reduce their toxic pollution and provides no new deadline. Second, the legislation adds confusion to the Clean Air Act standard-setting process for air toxics and upends a process that has worked for 2 decades. If enacted, this legislation will guarantee years of litigation to sort out this confusion and could force EPA to adopt weak or meaningless emissions standards for these sources of toxic pollution. And finally, this legislation blocks EPA action on new emission standards for cement kilns until at least 15 months after the date of the enactment. The timeline is open-ended. The amendment before us addresses this last problem by stating that EPA must finalize a new boiler rule on the date that is exactly 15 months from the date of enactment. But this does not make this bill acceptable. This bill remains an attack on the Clean Air Act and undermines EPA's authority to protect the health of children and all Americans from toxic air pollution. I support this amendment, but remained opposed to the bill overall. Yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back balance of his time. Does anyone else seek recognition to speak for or against the amendment? Since no one seeks recognition, the question will now occur on the approval of the amendment. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted.
Mr. Chairman?
Are there, for what purpose the gentleman from
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. Russia 01.
Clerk will report the gentleman's amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2681 offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
Without objection, the reading amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, as indicated earlier, cement kilns are a major source of mercury pollution and other toxic air pollution. Until last year, cement kilns had managed to avoid any sort of requirement to reduce these emissions. In August, the EPA finalized requirements for cement kilns to use readily available technology to cut their pollution. This bill nullifies these new health standards and requires EPA to go back to the drawing board. Supporters of this bill argue that it will provide certainty to industry when in fact it does precisely the opposite. First, as we discussed previously, this bill allows for an indefinite delay of the cement rules so that industry has no idea when it would have to comply with new emissions limits, if at all. Additionally, as written, Section 5 of 2681 will raise legal uncertainty and ambiguity for industry, for the EPA, and the courts over whether language contained in this bill should modify or supersede existing provisions of the Clean Air Act, which were designed to achieve maximum reductions in toxic air pollution. This section requires EPA to set emission standards for cement kilns that can be met, quote, consistently and concurrently, end of quote. It also requires EPA to select, quote, the least burdensome, end of quote, regulatory alternative, even if a stronger standard is feasible and would provide more public health benefits. While words like least burdensome and consistently and concurrently sound reasonable, in this case, they're both they are misleading. The Clean Air Act requires EPA to set toxic air pollution standards for cement kilns based on numeric emission levels that cleanup facilities are actually achieving in today's world, in the real world of today. Not in a lab, but in the real world. However, Section 5 could replace the existing criterion for EPA to set numerical emission standards with a requirement that EPA must always choose, quote, the least burdensome, end quote, regulatory option, including just requiring work practices standards, even if that option doesn't go far enough to protect public health and other feasible options are available. Mr. Chairman, I've been arguing that this section could gut the Clean Air Act and has the potential to weaken public health protections because the language in the bill is ambiguous. Does the bill intend to replace the existing criterion and let polluters off the hook, or does it intend to give EPA direction where they already have some discretion? Even for policymakers that are responsible for enacting this legislation, it is as unclear to us as it will be to them. And my amendment will clarify that Section 5 of H.R. 2681 is intended to supplement the provisions of and shall not be construed to supersede any requirement, limitation, or provision of Section 112 and 129 of the Clean Air Act. This amendment clarifies the rules and provides certainty for EPA, industry, and the courts. Mr. Chairman, I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I want to speak in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleague from Illinois. But let's be quite honest at what this is. This is an attempt to kill this bill, as we discussed earlier on a prior bill where you had a similar amendment. This is nothing more than an attempt to amend this to where it's ineffective and it's killed. But let's talk about just quickly, and I try not to take my whole 5 minutes, about what we're really dealing with here. We're dealing with at a time when Americans are looking for jobs. We're dealing with the potential of killing 20,000 jobs. This is an attempt to save jobs in the cement industry. We're talking about the potential of 18 of 100 cement plants closing, but we still need cement, right? I mean, obviously, you can close the plants, but you still have the requirement for cement. Where are we going to get that cement from? Well, if it's not going to be here, it's probably going to be somewhere like China. And what do we know when we get things from places like China that they don't have the environmental controls in the production of cement that we have here already? So when we talk about wanting to save the environment, and we all want to, we want a healthy environment. We want to make sure our kids are raised in a society where they're not exposed to these kinds of chemicals. But when you have an alternative of producing this in China and using them, giving them our jobs, buying their product, This is a net negative for the environment and a net negative for our economy. What we want to do is just give some breathing room to be able to comply with these standards. I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about jobs and jobs plans and jobs programs. Well, and I agree. One of the things that we can do, though, is make sure that our actions in Congress and our actions in government are not killing jobs. That would be a very good first initial step to an actual economic recovery. So I think when we look at that, I mean, this is the right thing to do. Let's give some breathing room, give some time, and let's move forward. So I yield back with that.
Gentlemen, yield to me. Would the gentleman from Illinois?
Yeah, I'd be happy to yield to my friend from Illinois.
Thanks, and I appreciate the time. And again, this is very similar to the debate we had with the other bill. Achievable just means achievable. The EPA does, and it will do a emittent by emittent standard, which, as we've heard already, is that whole debate on the Franken plants. I mean, so what we want is standards that are achievable, which is really what in the EPA in the Boiler MAC rule, that section 112D subsection 3 of the Clean Air Act is ambiguous as to whether the MAC floor is to be based on the performance of an entire source or on the performance achieved in controlling particular, in quotations, hazardous air pollutants. So we just want standards that are achievable by the industries today. And why is that important? As I mentioned in the opening statement yesterday, one of the big Lafarge operations in my district in Joplin, Illinois, they employ 110 men and women. They have an annual payroll of $10 million. They pay over $650,000 in state and county taxes, and this is in rural, poor, southern Illinois. They employ people from Illinois and also from Paducah, Kentucky, which is in the chairman's district. These rules and regs are a direct assault on these jobs, and the product from these plants go primarily right now to the Corps of Engineer Lock and Dam in Olmsted, which the chairman also knows is being built on the Ohio River, to major other construction projects. When we had the subcommittee markup and we talk about the need for infrastructure and concrete, obviously cement's a major product, a production of concrete, which will be used in our roads and our bridges and our locks and dams. Additional rules and regulations will make the cost of this higher than it is, meaning less projects. So I appreciate my colleagues' support. I'd ask people to reject this amendment.
If, pardon me, if the gentleman would yield, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thank you very much. Just briefly, if I could just add to the previous two gentlemen from Illinois. Just for the National Manufacturers Association, I asked them to give me the numbers of manufacturing jobs that are on this committee alone. Back in March of this year, we had 1.8 million manufacturing jobs, and that has dropped to 1.55 million since then. We're losing jobs in this country, and as the gentleman just mentioned, that these jobs will go overseas, and we just can't, we all want clean air and clean water, but at the same time we want to have achievable standards. We've got to be able to do that. Otherwise, in another 2 months when I'm sitting here, I'll be telling you how many more jobs we've lost, and now we're down to 1.55 from 1.8 earlier this year, and I yield back.
The time of the gentleman from Illinois has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California to speak in favor of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, what we've just heard is an argument that that we shouldn't kill jobs, but the alternative may be to kill children, and that doesn't make sense. I think that the existing law should be allowed to work. I fear that this bill undermines the fundamental premises of Section 112 and 129 of the Clean Air Act by establishing two new criteria for setting emission standards for toxic air pollution. Does this bill provide a breather? Well, not for the kids. What it does is say to the cement industry that they won't have to do anything, but not during the recession, maybe forever. There's no great demand now for cement because my friends on the other side of the aisle wouldn't support efforts
to use government funds for construction in our infrastructure. That would have provided jobs. It would have provided a market for cement. But the answer to that request was no, we can't spend money because that'll widen the deficit. So instead, what we see are economic problems in many of our communities. I know that the argument on the other side is that these provisions sound reasonable, but in actuality, the Section 5 of the bill could dramatically weaken EPA's ability to require cement kilns to reduce toxic air pollutants such as mercury and dioxins. At a minimum, it's utterly unclear how the new language interacts with the existing criteria for standard setting. On controversial issues such as these, that glaring ambiguity guarantees years, if not decades, of litigation. That's quite a breather. Decades of litigation. The provisions could replace effective clean air authority that has worked well for 20 years. The bill requires EPA to set toxic air pollution standards for cement kilns based on the best performers in the industry, the facilities with the lowest emission levels. EPA is not going to base these emission reductions on pie-in-the-sky technology. They calculate what is being done now to actually achieve these emission reductions in the real world. Section 5 of this bill may gut these public health protections. Rather than have EPA choose the best performing sources for all pollutants, I think this is an impossible task. Is a facility with the lower lead emissions better or worse than a facility with the lower mercury or arsenic or dioxin? Giving EPA open-ended and unworkable directions is a recipe for delayed litigation and weak, if any, standards. What we have in the law is the maximum achievable reductions. What we have in this bill is the minimum reduction, and it's very ambiguous as to that. If Section 5 requires EPA to select the least burdensome regulatory alternative, even if there's a feasible and economically viable alternative that would be more protective of human health, that should be what EPA should select. Environmental lawyers have said this would result in a lot of litigation. One could interpret this new criteria as overriding the existing criteria for determining the maximum achievable pollution reductions. What we do know is that if Section 5 of the bill overrides this current standard, we are going to have the weakest possible protections of public health. Congress should be clear about what this language means and not leave it to the courts to sort out. That's why I'm supporting Mr. Rush's amendment. It simply states that the language in Section 5 supplements but does not replace the requirements that have been in the Clean Air Act for the past 20 years. It clarifies the EPA should still set numeric emission limits to reduce toxic air pollution unless such limits are not feasible as described in the statute. My colleagues, we have two choices. Support the Rush amendment to clarify that the bill is not designed to let cement kilns off the hook for their toxic pollution, or oppose the Rush amendment and admit that this bill goes much further than its supporters claim it does. And I urge everyone on this committee to support the Rush amendment, make this clear clarification in support of public health.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Opposition to the Rush amendment is not going to kill children. We have to think about what will hurt children, and that is if their parents don't have a job. And if this rule goes into effect, 20% of our cement plants will be shut down, and families won't be able to provide for their children or have health insurance to send them to a doctor when they're sick. And that's what this is all about. The EPA, it's okay if they regulate. We just want them to do it the right way. And I'm in opposition to the Rush Amendment. Section 112 and 129 direct EPA to set maximum achievable control technology for sources that emit hazardous air pollutants. While it should be clear from the statute that these will be achievable in practice, courts have created ambiguity. EPA is currently following a pollutant by pollutant approach and setting standards that cannot be met by real-world boilers. This is sometimes referred to as the Franken boiler or the Franken plant problem. This approach is not required by the Clean Air Act. The purpose of H.R. 2681 is to clarify Congress's intent that EPA must set standards that are actually achievable in practice by real-world units. H.R. 2681 specifies that the administrator must ensure that the emission standards set can be met under actual operating conditions and can be met at the same time for all pollutants being regulated under the rule. Put simply, achievable means achievable. This amendment would create confusion for EPA because the agency would have to choose between the existing language in the statute and Congress's clarification in this bill that the standards being set are achievable in practice by real-world facilities. Ambiguity has kept these rules in litigation since 2004, and it is critical that Congress provide additional direction to EPA. I urge you to vote no on this amendment.
Gentleman, does the gentleman yield back the balance of time? The Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Let me thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've listened very closely to this debate, and I think there are some valid points on both sides. But, you know, if we have to choose between children and cement boilers, I think we have to trend in the direction of protecting our children. But I want to learn more about this and have an open mind about it because there are good points on both sides. I yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Illinois. Mr. Rush.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Chairman, my friend from Illinois, Mrs. Kinsley, talked about breathing room, and I must just say to him that all delay is not breathing room. You know, I mean, and there are breathing rooms that have different levels, and so there are rooms that are breathing that you and I wouldn't want to spend 5 minutes in them because the room is so, the air in the room is so toxic, and the air outside the room is so toxic. And this debate kind of reminds me of I can imagine the debate around back at the turn of the century around the air in coal mines, and there's some probably taking the same position that jobs was at stake, and that so what if there was a black lung disease that threatens the workers? You know, industry needed the jobs. But on the issue of jobs, Mr. Chairman, I think that Mr. Steve Perstein in the Washington Post the other day, I think he put this fairly clearly and succinctly in 2 paragraphs in his column entitled "The Magical World of Voodoo Economists rather. And he says, one recent example of voodoo economics or voodoo economists comes from the cement industry, which now warns that new regulation limiting emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide could close as many as 18 of the 100 cement plants in the U.S., resulting in a direct loss of 13,000 jobs. Then again, where do you think all those customers of the 18 plants will get their cement? Do you think that they might get some of them from the other 82 plants, which in turn might have to add a few workers to handle the additional volume, or that a higher price for cement might induce somebody to build a modern plant to take advantage of the suddenly unmet demand, or perhaps that our higher prices for cement will lead some customers to use another building material produced by an industry that will have to add workers to increase its output. And what about the possibility that the regulation will encourage some innovative company to devise emissions control equipment that will not only allow some of the plants to remain open, but generate a few thousand extra jobs of its own as it exports to plants around the world? Such possibilities are rarely, if ever, acknowledged in these, and I quote, job scare studies and the job scare rhetoric that we've heard today. Also left out of many of the estimates of the benefits that might accrue in terms of longer, healthier lives. In the Republican alternative universe, it's all costs, no benefits when it comes to government regulations, all costs and no benefits. As they see it, government regulators wake up every morning with an uncontrollable urge to see how many jobs they can destroy. And that's the end of his article. Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that, you know, the way I've heard it this morning and during these hearings on this bill, you know, it's the EPA doesn't stand for the Environmental Protection Agency anymore. It's the Evil Practices Agency. And I don't agree with that. The EPA is not the Evil Practices Agency. It's the Environmental Protection Agency. And so I wish that my friends from the other side will get on this. We don't have to have either or. We can have both and. What about both and? We can have clean air and good jobs. We can have clean air and either cement industry that meet standards that's set by the EPA, or, as Mr. Furstein said, why not using our innovative skills and wherewithal to create additional building materials that won't threaten the air that we breathe. Mr. Chairman, I would hate to get to a point where we have to send a canary into the cement manufacturing facilities before the workers can go in.
I reclaim my time and yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Bill Bray, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I just ask both sides to take a look at the way the discussion's been going and understand that we've been talking about maximal achievable reductions based on a stationary source. And the discussion on the other side of the aisle has been almost like an assumption that the one stationary source is all that we need to look at, is all that's considered. And I would just try to ask colleagues on both sides of the aisle to at least admit that the historical approach by EPA to these issues that have been stationary source by stationary source now is being transferred into a concept that will go cross-state transport as if that's the holistic real-world experience. I challenge you to the fact that the real-world experience is not even considered by EPA and legislatively is not required to be considered by EPA. They get to look at a snapshot in a small area of the globe and then assume that is the entire impact. I don't know how many people on this committee would accept an amendment that no regulatory modification should occur unless there's a guarantee that there will not be any increase of toxic materials or of mercury. You can go down the list anywhere in the country. And if you gave that kind of condition, that I want to guarantee that a change in the Midwest is not going to cause more mercury to hit my constituents in San Diego, and I will not support any agency that may modify a rule that causes that, that's a very defensible position in my district. And you may say this is not real-world experience. I think we saw the renewable fuel issue that ended up having to look at real-world experiences, and nobody in EPA, when they proposed that rule change, considered the fact that their rule change would lead to the destruction of carbon sink in third world countries while rainforests were cut down to grow food to replace material that was being used for other strategies that the EPA thought was great. And nobody even considered the global impact of so much of this stuff. So I just have to say this, we shouldn't take too high a mighty approach that we know exactly what's going. We ignore the fact that we want to talk about minorities are disproportionately impacted by pollutant exposures, which is true, but they are also exposed more to economic downturns proportionally in a matter of 2 or 3 times what the general population is. You want to talk about that. There's environmental risk and economic risk. But I've just got to turn right back around and say, I can't be assured that if we put these regulations in the Midwest, that this production and this emissions is not going to end up in Monterrey, Mexico, or in China, and my constituents in California are going to be impacted. My children in San Diego are not going to have a higher mercury exposure than what they have today. And don't tell me that, oh, this is absolutely impossible. We've seen exactly how underestimated the global impacts of our national and local regulatory oversight has been. So I just ask everybody that we just understand that this is not as simple as either side would like to point out, but there's economic and environmental impact. And for those that want to say that this is all about children as opposed to businesses, no, this is talking about a balance between a proper environmental and economic strategy that balances the fact that our constituents need a safe environment and a healthy economy. And there's no such thing as a safe environment where there is not a healthy economy. Now yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there any other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none. The vote now occurs on the Rush Amendment. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. Noes appear to have it. The noes have it. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll on the Rush Amendment.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkiss. Mr. Shimkiss votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes no. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none. Oh, can't see that hand. Mr. Sullivan.
Mr. Sullivan votes no.
He's hiding. Other members? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 32 ayes, 13 nays. Oh, sorry.
No.
32 nays, 13 ayes.
32 nays, 13 ayes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments to the bill?
Chairman.
Gentleman from California.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, the House leadership has determined that this week is Dirty Air Week. The raft of proposals moving through the House this week, if enacted, will cut the heart out of the Clean Air Act. We have a mercury pollution problem in this country. It's poisoning our lakes and rivers, and it is poisoning our children. The three biggest sources of mercury pollution are power plants, industrial boilers, and cement plants. At today's markup, we are giving industrial boilers and cement plants a pass on cleaning up their air pollution. Later this week, we'll consider the Train Act on the House floor. This will give power plants a pass on cleaning up their pollution. And we'll also consider the Latta Amendment. This proposal will reverse 40 years of clean air policy. Single-handedly, the Latta Amendment would gut clean air standards in every corner of the nation. And we've never had a hearing on it. We've never had a markup on it. We will get just 10 minutes of debate to consider it. It is a far-reaching and extreme proposal. All of these proposals that we're considering this week will, in my opinion, hurt Americans. They will not create jobs, and that's why I have called this week a Dirty Air Week for the Republican House agenda. Yield back the time.
Gentleman yields back. The question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. A roll call is requested. So the clerk will call the roll on final passage.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes
Other
aye.
members wishing to vote, Mr. Latta?
Mr. Latta votes aye.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote? If not, the clerk will report the tally. Yeah, yes, she voted. No. Mary Bono? Oh, yeah, I got it, yeah. It took me.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 33 ayes, 12 nays.
33 ayes, 12 nays. The bill is favorably reported and passed. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bills.
Reserving the right to object, Mr. Chairman.
Approved by the committee, so ordered. For what purpose does?
Well, don't order it yet, because I'm reserving the right.
Go ahead.
In order to confirm that this unanimous consent agreement would authorize committee staff to correct a technical drafting error to Section 7 of H.R. 2937 that inadvertently excluded hazardous liquid pipelines from the scope of the provision.
Without objection, that will be fixed correctly.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request on behalf of the minority the customary period of time in which we may file different views.
Without objection, so ordered. So the chair would thank all members and staff, and I just want to give Godspeed to Miriam Brown, who is left. Oh, here she is, still here. For a good markup. This will be her last markup for a number of weeks, as she is with child. So she's expecting this next week, so we wish her the very best. With that, the committee stands adjourned.